Today's February 9th in the year 2018. I'm Karen Herman, and have the pleasure of interviewing Martha Quinn today in Malibu. And this is for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and the Interviews in Oral History of Television. Okay, so we're going to start right from the beginning. And again, thank you for doing this.
I'm so excited. I do just want to say that I am wearing these pleather, they're cool rock and roll pants, but I did just notice that I was making a lot of noise. So if you hear that, that's what's going on.
But it works. Okay, that's rock and roll. Okay, so let's start with a little bit of background information. And the first question, of course, is what was your name at birth?
My name was Martha Conrad Quinn, and I just kept it.
Okay, when and where were you born?
I was born in Albany, New York, May 11th, 1959.
And did you grow up there?
No, I lived there for like 6 months, and then I moved to Ossining, New York, home of Sing Sing Prison. And it is also where Peter Falk grew up in Ossining, New York. And when you hear the phrase sent up the river, that's up the Hudson from New York City to Ossining to Sing Sing, which was my hometown.
Did you get a lot of flack from that as a kid?
You know, back then, people would always say, "Oh, you know, Sing Sing, what are you doing, time?" But I haven't heard that in a long time, and so I don't know if Sing Sing is just fading from people's memories. It's Ossining Correctional Facility, and you know, it's gotten legit. I don't know what's going on, but no, I went to Ossining High School all through Ossining, and then went to NYU.
Great. Talk a little about your parents, their names, and what they did.
My mom, and she is an she's 90 years old, and she lives in Troy, New York, and she is an uber musician. Like, she could, even today, sit down at the piano and knock out some Franz Liszt, and she'll say, "Oh, I just can't play like I could before," and she'll like play something amazing. So when I always tell my kids, you know, when I'm driving in the car and I'm singing at the top of my lungs, you know, to some song, and they'll be like, "Oh, Mom, stop," and I'm like, "I can't help it. I've got the music in me." And the reason I do is because of my mom.
That's great. And your dad?
My dad was an attorney and always into acting, so I got a little bit of the, you know, ham from my dad and a little bit of the music from my mom.
Do you do professional acting, or?
No, not really. I did as a kid. I mean, I was class actress in Ossining High School, but you know, I got myself through college. I'm probably jumping ahead, but doing two things. I did television commercials like, you know, McDonald's and Clearasil and stuff like that. And I worked at the the college radio station, which unbeknownst to me at that time, because this was before MTV went on the air, it was the perfect training ground for MTV.
Okay, so we're talking about your family. Any siblings?
I have 2 older brothers and 2 younger brothers.
Okay. And what do you think you inherited from your parents?
What did I inherit from my parents?
What did you?
Definitely my appreciation for music from my mom and from my dad. You know, he was always a great orator and always into theater and learning. And I think I definitely got just doing something, like I knew ever since I could even think, like, I'm not going to have an office job. That's just doesn't seem like that's ever going to be me. I'm going to be doing something. I wasn't sure if I was going to be doing something more like what you're doing, like a journalist, or if I was going to be doing commercials or TV shows, or what exactly I was going to be doing. But I knew that I wasn't going to be doing some kind of business. I just don't have that gene particularly.
Were you thinking about what you wanted to be when you grew up, or just
I always
you knew
thought
what you didn't
I would
want,
be in some kind of performing realm. I was always doing the class plays and always in the chorus and that kind of thing. And I started working on our Ossining High School radio station, and right then, because I had been Anna and the King and I started working on the radio station, and I was like, wow, this is so much better. I don't have to memorize any lines. I don't have to wear any costumes or anything. And then when I went to Colgate University, my first year of college, I right away started working on their radio station and really just starting to like it. And I started to feel like, okay, I either want to go into radio or journalism, at which point my stepmom, who is Jane Bryant Quinn, and she was the personal finance contributor for CBS News for many years and Newsweek, and she said, "You've got to get out of Hamilton, New York, and go to where," and by the way, Colgate, I loved you. It was really fun. But she said, you know, you should really be where the action is. And so then I moved to New York City and started working on WNYU, my college radio station. So it was pretty clear that radio was becoming my focus.
When you went into television, did she give you any advice about television?
No, she didn't really give me advice about television. She, at that time, you know, I started doing something totally different from what she was doing. I was doing the television commercials. And then, you know, MTV came along, and it was just such a different breed of animal that everybody was just kind of flummoxed by the whole thing.
So did you listen to a lot of radio as a kid?
Yes, I did. I listened to a ton of radio. I primarily listened to Casey Kasem. I was one of those people who would sit there and I would not leave my radio until I got, you know, Casey got all the way to *1. I would write down, you know, oh my gosh, you know, last week Starland Vocal Band, you know, whatever was #5. Now it's moved up. I think that Casey really gave me my love for little music trivia facts. And I listen to him even now because we play him on our radio station. And he's so legendary. He's just the best. I just love how Casey is such a good storyteller and communicator, and how he works in his facts. And I definitely listened to a ton of radio.
What were your musical interests, though, when you were younger?
Well, I was all Beatles all the time, 24/7, every single day. My friend Carol Martin and I would come home and we would put on a Beatle album and we would play cards or whatever, you know, kids did back then. But we were always listening to the Beatles, maybe a little bit of Queen. I sometimes say my sticky gooey core, as I once heard little Steven describe his love for the Ramones. My sticky gooey core is probably Queen's A Night at the Opera, because I did eventually spin off into more of a, you know, the hair bands and all of that, but it's kind of that center between the Beatles and hair bands. And so definitely, but I would have to say that I was highly influenced by the Beatles. And I think the first album I ever bought is somebody that I happen to know you interviewed recently. I believe my first album I ever bought as a kid, like, I don't know how old I was, but was a Monkees album.
You interviewed Mickey Dolenz yesterday.
I heard that. That's very exciting. I heard that you interviewed Mickey, so that's really cool. I think I bought the Monkees' Greatest Hits. It was my first ever record.
Did you watch the show?
I guess I did watch the show. Yes, I did watch the show.
What'd you think of it?
I think I loved it. You know, I'm hemming and hawing a little bit because I have a vague memory of the show. I more have a memory of the music.
Oh, that's so interesting, because they really were very different.
Yeah.
And that's cool. What other
intertwined? Yeah.
Yeah. What other television shows did you watch growing up?
Gosh, what TV shows did I watch? I always watched. You know, this was back in the day. So I guess I should say I always watched Family Ties and Cosby. No, I'm just kidding. I do go back a little earlier than that. You know, I always watched the Mike Douglas show because it was on after school, and I always remember just waiting to see, because every once in a while Mike Douglas would have on like a John Lennon or something like that. I mean, normally it was, you know, Edie Lawrence and what's their names?
Steve Lawrence and Edie Gourmet?
Yeah, Steve Lawrence and Edie Gourmet would be people like that. But every once in a while there would be a John and Yoko or somebody like that. So I would always watch the Mike Douglas show. And then, you know, back then there wasn't that much going on. It was like reruns or something like that. But I remember watching that.
Did you watch any music shows?
I didn't watch that many music shows. I can address American Bandstand, which you and I talked a little earlier, that later on as a music professional and going back and watching Dick Clark, like I didn't particularly watch that show growing up, but now I watch his footage and I am so amazed by Dick Clark. And what I love most about Dick Clark is when he would interview a band, is that he would like literally turn his back and he'd be like, hey, the drummer in the back. He was so concerned about the musicians, way less than his camera time. He was so giving to everybody on that stage. And I just loved how he did that. He was always really smooth, yet really supportive and generous.
Okay. Is that something you learned after you were already in
Yes,
business?
because what would happen is I would be like, oh, I want, you know, I'm always about the trivia. So like, oh, I wonder, you know, what it was like when the Go-Go's first went on Dick Clark. Did they give him any tidbits? And I'll go back and I'll watch a lot of these early interviews because it's kind of interesting to see, you know, everybody back then hit American Bandstand. So I'll go back and I'll watch and I'll see if I can pick up something that they dropped a tidbit off, you know, oh, they had a dog named, or, you know, it was their first tour, or they were still living with their parents or something like that. And so I really, really, as a professional, is when I really started to assess, you know, American Bandstand. So I just have so much regard for Dick Clark. I really do. And I love that they still call New Year's Eve Dick Clark's Rockin' New Year's Eve. I think that's so awesome. I hope that they never get rid of that because he fully deserves that.
Did you ever meet him?
Yes, I believe I did. I went into his office, but why? I did go in and meet him. I don't remember now why, but I did. But I don't remember why, but I did meet him. And then my husband and I saw him at a restaurant in Malibu, and he was very, very old at that time. But it was one of those things where I didn't say anything, but everybody in the restaurant was like, and I was so happy for him that he still had that effect on everybody because he's really legendary.
Yeah. What about some of those other shows, like Midnight Special?
Oh, yeah, I guess I did watch Midnight Special. And I would watch Wolfman Jack. And the funny thing about watching shows like Midnight Special is they would say, okay, on tonight, Phoebe Snow, Foghat, and Paul McCartney. And so you'd be waiting all night long for Paul McCartney. And then at the very end of the show, they would play a Paul McCartney video. And it would be like, what? Back then, videos seemed like, he's not really there. Come on. It seemed almost like a ripoff, which is why when MTV started, everyone said people are never going to watch those videos over and over and over because a video was the second-class citizen to an actual appearance.
Right, and plus you have to remember too that there were VCR, there weren't things to record, and you can only you saw it once and that was it.
Yeah, it really was like, come on, you fooled me. This is not him performing. Like, look at how Foghat did it. That's how you're supposed to do it.
Very cool. Soul Train, any memories of that?
Well, Soul Train is another band that came onto my radar later because when I was in college, I did a whole bunch of different shows on the college radio station, and one of the shows that I did was an urban show, and so bands like Shalimar came onto my radar, which is a band that Don Cornelius put together. So that's sort of, again, in hindsight, it came to see, you know, go, oh, wow, okay, so he got, you know, Jody Watley and Howard Hewitt together, and he formed that band. That's really interesting. So I sort of learned about Don Cornelius in hindsight.
Okay. What about Saturday Night Live? A lot of people first saw some.
I remember watching a lot of Saturday Night Live in college. What do I remember seeing? I don't. Okay, I'm drawing a blank on that. As far as I don't have, you know, I'm not a big television person, so I don't have a lot of television-oriented memories. Who did I see on Saturday Night Live? You know, artist-wise. I mean, I know so many people have done it, but I don't have overwhelm. I'll let you know if something pops into my head.
Let's move on and talk about MTV and how that came about for you.
Okay, so I go to NYU, and one of the advantages my stepmother, Jane Bryan Quinn, had told me about being in New York City as opposed to Hamilton, New York, which is where I was first in college at Colgate University, is that let's say you have an internship with somebody, that internship might be at a business that you want to work at after college. And I thought, okay, that made sense. And when it came time to get an internship, one of the possibilities was being a college intern at WNBC, which was sort of the rival to WABC, which was the king pop music radio station, but WNBC was a contender. So I got this internship at WNBC, and I was in the back closet, smaller than the closet here, alphabetizing the singles, literally alphabetizing singles because, you know, there was no computer anything back then. So when somebody came in with a new single and you filed it away, well, where is it? You know, did you put, you know, Shalimar's are you doing this chronologically? Are you doing everything alphabetically? What if it's Dolly Parton and, you know, Kenny Rogers, who, do I have that right? Right? Islands in the Stream was Dolly Parton and Kenny Rogers, right? You know, who was that filed under? So, So I was back there, writing index cards. And the person who was my supervisor, his name was Buzz Brindle. He was also my college professor in one of my classes at NYU. And my classes were literally, I'm not even kidding. Another one of my professors was Richard Neer, who was a legendary New York DJ. And it'd be like, okay, if you play Led Zeppelin at 10:25, do you go to commercial before or after Black Sabbath? It's like, that's the kind of classes that I took. So I was an intern at WNBC. And I was literally like saying to Buzz, I don't understand why you're not asking me to pick records. And he's like, because you're an intern. I'm like, oh, yeah. So I was getting Don Imus coffee, things like that. So I did that for my senior year of college. And then when I graduated college, I kept on working at my day job at school, which was handing toilet paper out to residents of Weinstein Dormitory. And those residents included future CBS honcho Rick Rubin, future mayor of New York, Bill de Blasio. So I was still working at Weinstein, taking messages. I was a desk clerk at Weinstein Dormitory, which is a legendary dorm at NYU. So this is where the Beastie Boys got started too. Rick Rubin, Russell Simmons, they started the Beastie Boys at Weinstein. So anyway, so I was going home one day from Weinstein, and I was literally wearing the clothes that I got up in the morning to go be a desk clerk at Weinstein. And there was terrible traffic in New York, and I decided, okay, I'm never going to get home. I was living in the Upper East Side. I'm going to hop off the bus. And I hopped off, and I called from a payphone up to NBC, and I said, hey, I'm right outside. I'm at Rockefeller Center. Are you guys still there? It's really bad traffic. I'm going to come up and kick around, say hello, because, it's been a couple weeks or months since I'd seen them, since I'd already graduated. So we're just sitting around the office, and as luck would have it, this guy was in from California. His name was Bert Stein. He later formed a record company with Danny Fields called Gold Mountain Records. And he said, hey, what's Bob Pittman doing? Bob Pittman had been the program director for WNBC. He was one of the youngest programmers in the country, so he was kind of a wonderkind. And, even for me, I didn't run across him, but he was legendary because he had just left, and, everybody knew, ooh, Bob Pittman. But I didn't exactly know where he went off to. I just knew that he wasn't there. And then Buzz, who I was working for, said, oh, he's doing this cable music channel. And then Buzz turns to me and says, Martha, that's what you should do. You should be a VJ on MTV. And I said, what's MTV? And he said, oh, it's just like being on the radio, but on TV. And I said, oh, I can't do that. You know who'd be good at that? Evan Davies, who I say his name because he works at WFMU still in New York City. And I always say, I was trying to get you that job. And Buzz was like, no, you definitely should audition for this. And I said, well, what is it exactly? And he said, well, it's like being on the radio, but it's on TV. And back then, if you say to somebody, it's like being on the radio, but it's on TV, back then, that was WKRP in Cincinnati. And I said, well, I'm picturing this. And I said, well, what do I do during the records? And he said, which seems like a silly question, but nobody was thinking videos. And he said, no, it's videos. It's videos. It's not records. Because I was thinking, well, how is that going to work? I'm going to play the record and I'm just going to sit there? And so he said, no, it's videos. He's like, I'm telling you, you should audition. He picks up the phone. He calls Bob Pittman right then. He says, there's this girl here. I think she should audition. Pittman says, it's our last day. Send her down. I get in a cab wearing the clothes that I was wearing to work at Weinstein, which was a T-shirt that said, country music is in my blood. If I can find the audition, I have it somewhere, I'll send you a copy. And shorts and sneakers. And I went down, I walked in and I said, I'm here to audition for something. By now it's like 5:45. And I said, Bob Pittman told me to call. And they go, oh, okay, yeah. Come on out onto the set. And I went out and I sat in the barber chair. And they said, what concerts have you seen recently? And I said, well, Earth, Wind, and Fire. I've seen them a bunch. I'll talk about that. And it's so good that I had no idea what it was all about, that I was auditioning for like the job of a lifetime, because I'm sure I'd have been way more nervous. But at that point, I was pretty used to auditioning for Campbell Soup commercials and stuff like that. So throughout, I probably talked to them for 5 minutes. But by the time I left, even just walking or looking around and seeing like, oh, okay, I see a lot of like rock posters up on the wall. I kind of see what's going on. And I called my brother from a payphone and I said, I think I just auditioned for the greatest job I could ever even imagine. And he was like, oh my God. And he was like, tell me about it. And I was telling him, I was like, oh gosh, now I really hope I get that job. And, 2 days later they called and they did offer it to me.
What do you think they saw in you?
This is what I think. Unbeknownst to me, just a couple days prior, a short brunette radio personality, her name is Meg Griffin, and she's a New York radio legend. She's still on the radio now. Meg had decided she didn't want to give up her radio career, which they wanted her to do. And I don't blame her. I didn't even quit Weinstein at first because I was not even sure, well, is this really going to happen? Is this going to be a sure thing? So I kept my job at the dorm. I could imagine I wouldn't want to give up my radio job. And she was like, I just don't think I want to do that. So she left. So they were out. So they were like, we need somebody quick. I mean, this was literally like July 13th, and they went on the air August 1st, as I'm sure you know. And so I think that they saw that I could speak and that I could somewhat carry on a conversation. And I think they were like, phew, let's try her.
Okay, and you'd said that you've been on commercials and things before. You weren't. This was.
I had done a lot of commercials in college. Like I was a Chicken McNugget girl. Like I said, you'll go nuggets for McNuggets. That was my famous line. So I did all kinds of commercials like that throughout college. So, I did have an ability to be on camera, and I did have music knowledge. Like, it is kind of crazy that I walked in as somebody who had both on-camera experience and pretty extensive music experience by that time from all the different radio stations that I'd been involved with. I mean, granted college, but still. And as I started out by saying, I definitely had the music in me. So I think it worked out pretty perfectly. The freight trains of fate just collided pretty perfectly.
Wow. So you said they said to audition for a VJ. Was that the term they actually used, VJ?
Yes, I believe he said, you should be a VJ on MTV. And I said, what's a VJ? And he said, oh, it's like being a DJ, but on TV, at which point I could only think Dr. Johnny Fever. And so I was thinking, well, okay, I'm on TV. I put on the record starts playing. Now what? Now what happens? What do you do during the records? But I didn't, nobody would have thought of videos because, videos were everybody's second-class citizen. So, in the music world.
Yeah, so you get the job. How
Yes.
long did you have to prepare once you got that call?
Oh, how long did I have to prepare?
Yeah,
well,
was it like...
Well, first of all, can I just say, they offer me the job, like saying, there I am. I'm just out of college. And they're like, so, would you like a job interviewing rock stars and being on TV? And I'm like, yes, please. I was so worried because they didn't have a contract right then. And I called my dad, who was an attorney, and he was like, have them sign anything, have them sign anything. So if you're wondering why I got paid the least of anybody in the beginning, that's why. I guess I would have paid me the least, too. I mean, I was the youngest and the most inexperienced, but I was salivating for that job.
So how did you ramp up for that first day?
Well, we all just, kind of were in a studio space and just practicing, and I didn't even know that we were ramping up to a first historic day. I didn't even realize that because, now we have a historical perspective of what MTV was. At this time, it just seemed like yet another, I'd done a couple of crazy off-Broadway things that seemed to be kind of similar, like, well, I'm just in this loft warehouse doing this kind of crazy thing. Who knows, There's so many, artsy projects going on in the Village in New York City at any given time, I'm sure. So it just seemed like, okay, what's this, And so we were just all practicing and rehearsing and, acting like there was videos there. And then before you knew it, I mean, literally, some people at MTV had been working on this for 2 years. So for them, it was ramping up to the big day. That's an accurate description. I just wasn't aware of it at that time. For some people, it was the day the baby was going to be born. For me, it was just like, yeah, okay, this seems good. I don't think I should quit my dorm job yet because we'll see what happens. I kind of really got it the night that we were all together in that little restaurant in New Jersey watching the cable channel that had MTV. The reason we were in a little restaurant in New Jersey is because it was the only place anywhere near us that was carrying this. And seeing that initial countdown and seeing that first rocket blast go off, and it was like, oh my gosh, this is so exciting. And everybody was crying. It was an amazing night. More so for a lot of the people who, like I say, they've been investing 24/7 all of their hopes and dreams and creative inspiration for so long. But I definitely got a sense of, wow, you know what? Hey, this is really exciting. I'm really excited about this.
That's terrific. Talk about the first time that you met the other original VJs.
Let's see. I don't remember specifically meeting them, but I do remember thinking that they were the absolute coolest people I'd ever met in my life. You know, Alan was hired a couple days after me, so the first people I would have met was Mark and JJ and Nina. And I was totally enamored with them and thought they were so cool. It's almost like your mom tells like the older sibling, hey, look, I don't have a babysitter. You have to take your baby sister with you. And they were forced to like be with me all the time. And I really thought that they were just the coolest people that I'd ever met. And we're all still such a close family today. It's really remarkable. That's one of my things that I'm most grateful about for the MTV experience is my VJ family.
Okay, let's talk about them one by one, just to,
Okay.
you know, if someone's never met them or seen them.
Okay.
Mark Goodman, let's start with him.
Mark Goodman came to MTV pretty professional. He had already been on the radio in Philadelphia. He had been on WPLJ in New York City. So he was really, really, you know, he knew what he was doing as far as the rock and roll DJ world. And he had such a great way of being on camera and being informative yet irreverent. He was so, and he's still so good at that. He was so just like that perfect, spunky, yet doing, you know, the right job and being rocker. He had such a great way about him. Nina also had on-camera experience out here in California. She was sort of already involved in the video music world out here. So there was already sort of a movement of doing on-camera interviews. And Nina played the harp, and she's a long-time rock and roller in her unique way, sort of coming up as a musician, and then just before MTV doing some little interviews and projects out here. And she was insanely glamorous and, you know, blonde and super sexy and just, you know, totally sultry. And so she had, checked a lot of boxes for MTV for sure. I'm saving JJ for last for a reason. Alan Hunter was kind of more like me in that he was sort of young and he had moved to New York to be an actor. And he had met Bob Pittman at a picnic in New York City for Mississippi natives. So, and because Al's wife at that time was from Mississippi, and Al had gone to college in Mississippi, and somehow Bob Pittman started talking to Al, who really had a Robin Williams sort of way about him, really funny and present himself really well. And Bob Pittman said, hey, you should come in and audition, which he did, and he got the job. So he and I were sort of the new kids on the block. JJ came to MTV, a rock and roll legend, and I think this is so, so important. JJ came to MTV being someone who had worked at WBCN, which was a legendary rock and roll radio station in Boston, and JJ worked at WBCN when Led Zeppelin came to the United States for the first time, JJ was driving the members of Led Zeppelin around in his station wagon, in his beat-up old station wagon, showing them around Boston. He emceed their show at the Boston Tea Party, and Led Zeppelin later went on to credit JJ as helping to launch them here in the United States. That is so monumentally huge. So JJ was already a rock and roll legend when he walked in the door at MTV. People like Rod Stewart, Roger Daltrey would only talk to JJ because they knew of his really, important contribution to the world of rock and roll, especially for the British artists who were coming here and making their inroads to the U.S. market. And, Rod Stewart gave JJ a car, and Rod Stewart did come to JJ's service, and Robert Plant sent flowers. And, for such a long time, when those guys would come into the MTV studios, they would only talk to JJ.
What about Bob Pittman himself?
Bob, it's so funny. Bob Pittman is the most interesting person. First of all, he has boundless energy. He is one of the people who created MTV and put it on the map, and to shepherd through an entirely new idea when everyone is saying, nobody will watch videos over and over. Nobody will do it. And to shepherd it through and to make it a whole cable channel that Warner Communications and American Express is backing, you have to have so much spunk and conviction, which Bob had. And my favorite aspect of Bob has emerged to me recently. I work on an iHeartRadio music station right now, and I was brought aboard by Bob Pittman. And what I love about my station is that we are a family. Everybody works together. It's a team. And I always think the last time I was in a situation like this, where everybody was on a team and had a mission, we were rebels with a cause, was at MTV. And I really think that that's Bob, who infused the corporate culture of where he's working with that team player mentality. And I have spoken to some other iHeart executives who were there when it wasn't iHeart, and they have credited Bob with changing the corporate culture of where they're working. And I just love that about Bob. And he's one of these guys who he is so smart, and basically whatever he's recommending or doing, you cannot go wrong betting on Bob Pittman.
That's great. What about the visual style of early MTV?
Now, do you mean the studio MTV, or do you mean the videos?
I mean the studio, the logos. There was a definite style to the.
Mark Goodman has the funniest description of our original studio. Like, at that time, we thought it was so cutting edge in rock and roll. It was almost sort of like a night at the Improv with the brick wall. But now you go back and you look at it, and it's like, well, it's the brick wall, the radiator, and like one tennis racket. But at that time, we thought it was so cutting edge and cool. And so, but really it was so rudimentary. I mean, Weird Al has gone on to say, that you would watch MTV and it was like filled with mistakes, and it was like looked like it was like Wayne's World before it was Wayne's World. But that's really what made it so great. I mean, when you hear guys like Guns N' Roses and Motley Crue talking about their early days when they're all sharing one apartment, on Sunset Boulevard, and they're sharing one sandwich, and David Lee Roth is crawling through the window. Those are often their favorite times. And I think that that's true of MTV. Anybody who was there in those early MTV days, we were such a family, and we were rebels with a cause, and we did believe in what we were doing. We believed in the power of rock and roll. We believed in, video music, and we just thought, we felt like we could change the world, and we were so infused with that.
When did you really think, oh my gosh, this really worked? This is really working?
Well, It took quite a while. Like, I probably worked at the dorm for 2 months before I quit my job. And it did take a while because at first we weren't in Manhattan. We were not in LA. We were just in some random markets. We were in, eventually it was a big deal. We got into Tulsa, Oklahoma. We'd get into like one little cable station at a time. Cable at that time was for areas of the country that couldn't get antenna reception. So it was often, mom and pop cable systems like out in farmland somewhere, because that's how that local little farming community could get television and any kind of television. So I remember going to Amarillo, Texas, and, talking to the cable, manager at Amarillo, Texas, what do you say? You want to carry MTV? And there was a lot of that going around to Fargo, North Dakota, and a lot of these kinds of, it was a real grassroots effort to get MTV. Now we think of it as this monolithic everywhere presence, but back then we were knocking on people's doors. Hey, we got some MTV buttons. Martha Quinn's here. Oh, well, she's on our show, and I'd just be like, there, yeah, want to take your picture with me? And all of us did that. Spent many weekend trips going out around the country to all kinds of places. Saying, do you want to have, like we were like door-to-door salesmen, basically, literally going to these cable channels. And now I've forgotten your question.
I was asking when you knew you made it.
Oh, I guess when MTV came into Manhattan, and I could actually, I say go downstairs, but I lived in a studio apartment with a little loft, so I'd climb down my ladder, and I would click on the TV, and oh my gosh, there we were. It's like, oh my God, whoa, we're really doing something. This is wild. And like everybody else in the world, when I first saw MTV, you literally couldn't stop watching. I would be late for my job at MTV because I couldn't tear myself away from MTV. It was so mind-blowing.
Yeah, what was the state of music video at the time? I mean, now it's it's a natural thing, but at that time when MTV launched, like how many, were there a lot to choose from?
Well, MTV started with, the number is 250 videos, which if you think about, over a 24-hour period, like if you look at the first videos that MTV ever played, Stevie Nicks and Tom Petty, Stop Dragging My Heart Around was played within the first, was like number 25, number 68, number 79. We had, what else? We had weird bands, PhD, Little Susie's on the Up. We played Iron Maiden we were playing in the beginning, Cliff Richard, obviously the Buggles, and Pat Benatar. And, we had 250 videos. Rod Stewart was one of our very frequent artists. So for those artists, it was a bonus because they were played all the time. Like Pat Benatar says, overnight, she went from being able to go shopping in the grocery store to not being able to in areas where there was MTV, because all of a sudden, she was just on TV 24/7. And, she's somebody who knew that her video was going to be her second video. And she was watching, I just always remember this story. They were in a hotel in Oklahoma, and they watched and they saw, her video come on. And then they just kept watching because they were like, oh my God, are they serious? Are they really doing this? It's hard to imagine now, but nothing like this, radio on television with all these music videos and seeing one artist after the next in these wild interstitials, the guitar coming through the screen graphic or the rocket ship graphic with the guitar. It's like nothing like this had ever existed before. So for everybody, all the musicians, the guys in ZZ Top at one point told me that they were just watching and literally could not believe it. They were like, what is going on? And that now we're blasé about it. But at that time, it was like, oh my God, this is literally the craziest thing. Yeah, there was just one last thing I wanted to mention about the day in July when I was leaving my job at Weinstein Dormitory at NYU, and I was heading back home to my 5th floor walk up on the Upper East Side, and there was a lot of traffic, and I decided, okay, I'm going to get off the bus and go up to WNBC and kick around and see what's doing. At that point, I heard somebody say, oh, you should be a VJ on MTV. And I often wonder to myself so many times, what if I didn't get off the bus? You know how there's those weird fate times? Like, who knew that getting off the bus, I could have just decided, oh, I'll just stay on the bus. And I would not be talking to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame if I stayed on that bus.
Oh, yeah, it's
kind of crazy.
one thing.
It was just crazy.
Yeah. So we're talking about the early days of MTV. What was your production? What was your production schedule like those early days?
Oh, our production schedule. Well, the secret about MTV is that we actually didn't watch the videos because it wouldn't make sense to pay a television crew to sit and, during Duran Duran Hungry Like the Wolf. So we would just do segment after segment after segment. In the very beginning, we did it like DJ shifts. I'm making it up, but Mark, Alan, JJ, Nina, Mark, Alan, JJ, Nina. And that way, because that's the only way people knew how to do it. Eventually, when we got to a more well-oiled machine, it would be Martha, Martha, JJ, JJ. So people would be like, oh, wait a second. Why don't we just do everybody together and then you can get out? But back in the early days, we were like a basket of kittens. Everybody was on top of each other 24/7. And it wasn't a well-oiled machine. It would take a long time. What are we saying? What are we doing? What if we do this? I mean, there were days when we'd get through an entire day and they'd go, oh, we forgot we didn't have the sound on. We're going to do it all again. But me, I could have lived in that studio 24/7. I did not care because I was young. I was not married. I had no kids. I had no pets. I was so in love with that job that, I could have just stayed there 24/7. So if they said, oh, we have to go longer, I'd be inside. I'd be like, cool. I don't have anywhere to go anyway. This is perfect for me. And it was definitely long days and, but everybody was together. All of us VJs, our first studio was in Hell's Kitchen before Hell's Kitchen was a TV show. It was like the real Hell's Kitchen. And we had a little studio and us VJs, all 5 of us, shared the tiniest dressing room. We were all we had like a little clothes rack. And Nina and I would kind of hide behind the clothes rack and we'd be getting changed. And but that really made for such bonding. It's that thing I was mentioning earlier, like when Motley Crue and Guns N' Roses all lived in the same apartment. That was us. And one time, J.J. Jackson left a big note on the blackboard saying, because of course Nina and I, all of our stuff and all of our makeup was just piled in the corner and clothes and sweaters, and JJ always had his stuff neatly folded and he was like, this place is a mess, and he drew a big arrow down to our stuff. And but that was just we were like the Brady Bunch practically, just always together all the time. There were times when, again, this was before we were in Manhattan. We were nobody. We were still all just working on this kind of weird experimental, Laurie Anderson style performance art project going on in, Hell's Kitchen. And we would get tickets to go see Bon Jovi at the Meadowlands, let's say. And there was no such thing as getting the VJs any kind of even car service. So I would rent the car. And I'd rent a little Ford Tempo. They would pay for that. And I would drive. I was like an Uber driver for the VJs. I was the VJ Uber driver. And I would drive around and pick up all the VJs. And this was before cell phones. So I'd get out, ring everybody's doorbells, come on down. We're all waiting downstairs. And I don't know why this fell to me, except, I was, so ready, willing, and eager. And I would drive everybody out. And we'd get out of the car at Brendan Byrne Arena. And then there was this kind of weird thing that would happen is that we'd all be piling out of the car. And eventually we were in New Jersey before we were in Manhattan. And there would be kids who'd be going hey, I know you guys. Hey, you're those people from MTV. And we'd be like, yeah. And we'd be getting out of our Ford Tempo. And they'd be like, hey, you want the Quinn, you're J.J. Jackson. And we'd be going in, to see Judas Priest, all of us, together. And we'd all have our little tickets. And at some point, MTV decided to pony up and, we got a car service. But there was many, many times, and I wish more than anything, I had a little recording of all of us, the 5 of us, just the 5 of us, no dates, no nothing, in the car going, to Brendan Byrne Arena to see Pat Benatar, Journey, or Judas Priest. I mean, we did this many, many times. But I'm jumping around, but you asked me earlier, when did I know that it was really something that it was going to take hold. At first when people, I went to NYU, and after I got my job at MTV, I stayed in Greenwich Village, and I got a little apartment very near my dorm. And when I'd run into people from college, I had friends who were still in college, and they'd go, "Oh, Martha, what are you doing now?" And I'd be like, "Oh my gosh, I'm never going to make my bus. I'm never going to make my bus," because I would have to explain, well, I'm doing this cable thing. And people back then would think cable was probably like Ugly George and Robin Bird. They pretty much dominated cable back then, public access. And it was like, are you going to keep your clothes on? That's like a big question that people had back then when you say that you were doing a cable show. And I'd be like, no, no, no. It's like being on the radio, but it's on TV. What do you mean? It's these videos. You know how on Midnight Special they show these videos? It's all videos. And I'm talking in between. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm so late now. I got to the point where I would tell people I'm teaching kindergarten, and I would be done with it because I didn't have enough time to explain. But eventually I could say, you know those commercials where Pete Townsend is saying, I want my MTV? That's where I work. And that's when I started to be able to point to something and say, that's where I'm working. And people would be like, oh, okay, yeah, I've seen those commercials. Yeah, okay, oh, that's cool. Even though we didn't have MTV in the city yet, but people knew those commercials because they were, so legendary. So, right away, demand your MTV. So that I could say, that's where I work.
That's great. You mentioned that the wardrobes and all that. Did they get your clothes for you? Were you bringing your own?
They gave us initially, they gave each of us $500 to buy clothes. And then they gave us this stylist who took us immediately to 57th Street, which meant for $500, we got like a sweater and a pair of socks. So the rest of it was up to us. I mean, I would be, this was, Boy George had a very interesting point about the 80s not that long ago. He said, the 80s was pre-stylist, pre the era of celebrity stylists. So what everybody was wearing was literally an expression of themselves. Us VJs were so different. JJ would be in his, floor-length rabbit fur jacket. Al would be in his, rainbow Robin Williams suspenders. I would be in my Pee Wee Herman t-shirt, or my Help Me Rhonda t-shirt, whatever I happened to have, that I happened to get at wherever store I was shopping at in Greenwich Village. I mean, tons of stuff that I wore on MTV is stuff that I had in college. That was my college clothes. So that was real, true 80s style. This was not somebody telling me because, hey, this will look cool. This was just what I had.
Did you have, were there any rules for what you could say, what you could do?
We went through various phases of rules. In the beginning, there was no rules. And then they said, okay, you know what? Everything's going to be on prompter. And then they go, oh, we're going to throw that out. Now, everybody just say what you want. There was, just in trying to figure out our voice, what MTV's voice was going to be, we kind of went through phases, but ultimately there wasn't too many rules because we didn't know what we were doing at that time. And there were times when they say, oh, you know what we're going to do? We're going to bring in this weird vocal distorter or harmonizer, and everybody's going to speak through this weird vocal harmonizer for a day, or everybody's going to wear masks for a day. I mean, it really was what works. We've just got to try. We'll try this. We'll try that. We had guys like streaking in the background, or we had the famed runaway camera, which was when, on super long days, if people were like dragging our camera, people created this thing called runaway camera, where they would all of a sudden just scream out, runaway camera, and you'd see a camera go behind us, and it would just lift up the spirit. I mean, it really was like, Wayne's World before Wayne's World.
Okay, so a lot of people thought that everything was done live.
Yeah, it had a very live feeling because we were not slick. We didn't even know how to be slick. We couldn't have been slick if we'd wanted to because we didn't know how to be slick. It was so, you know, flying by the seat of our pants. Plus, it did have a very live feel because we had a lot of segments to do. So we'd be just like, you know, what we would do if we really wanted to do something again is you would have to swear, because otherwise they would keep it. They'd just be like, keep going, you know, don't stop, don't stop. So if you really felt like you'd made a really, really bad mistake, you would just have to, you know, drop an F-bomb or something. So they would have to stop because they would really rather not stop because they had so much to get through, especially if it was a day when they're like, oh my gosh, you know, we have Kaja Gugu coming in at 3 o'clock. Everybody's got to be done. So, you know, they really wanted to get through. Plus, they didn't want to pay, no offense to you guys, but they didn't want to pay the camera crew overtime, you know. So I was like, let's go, let's go.
Like was it pretty scripted? I mean, how did you know what to do, what the bits were?
You know, it's funny. Like I said earlier, it always changed. I mean, but we'd always know certain things. Okay, you're going to sit here, you're going to talk music news, you're going to give concert dates. Okay, let's move to, you know, and it was a collaborative effort. Let's move to the barber chair and we'll talk about, you know, video coming up, or we'll talk about, it was sort of somewhat formatted. And we had a producer who would say like, okay, you know, now we're going to talk about, you know, our daughter's wedding. I'm making it up. That's my favorite Greenwich Village little band, but they actually were played on MTV in the early days. Or we're going to talk about, you know, Robert Hazard or whoever we were talking about at that time. You know, this was so early. You know, what's funny about MTV is when MTV started, there was no 80s. So all of our references, all of our rock and roll references were still, you know, the Ramones were still, the Bee Gees were still, you know, the Beatles were still Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, Blue Oyster Cult, Foreigner, Journey, you know, all of our references were still from the 70s, Queen, because there was no 80s yet. When we started, there was no Duran Duran, there was no Stray Cats, there was no Depeche Mode, there was no Madonna, there was no Cyndi Lauper. That was all to come. So all of these references that I'm giving you are, you know, little Greenwich Village bands that were sort of up and happening at that time, which, you know, many of whom, you know, just never continued, but we were sort of on them. You know, Talking Heads was early on. But again, they were, you know, they were from the late 70s too. So it's just interesting because we think of, you know, when I look back at, you know, trivia questions that I was doing in the early 80s, in the early days, it was all about the Beach Boys and stuff like that. There was no Def Leppard yet. It's just interesting how, you know, when we started, there was no 80s yet.
Yeah, and what do you think, I mean, how do you think what you started actually influenced what the 80s became?
Well, it's really funny because I think it's a marriage of both. Like, I'm not in the camp of MTV made Duran Duran, for example, because Duran Duran was already happening. They were already moving. I mean, I remember playing Duran Duran at my college radio station, so they were already on their way. Like, they had already done their Girls on Film video. They were already on their way. I think that was just a beautiful synchronistic meeting. And once, you know, they saw what MTV was becoming, then they saw what they could continue to bring to the table. So there was, especially over in Europe, there was already this sensibility of expressing themselves visually. And, you know, the American artists took a while to catch on. You know, it took a while for Bruce Springsteen to even say he was going to make a video. And his first video that he made, I think it was for The River. He wasn't even in. He was like, okay, send these guys a video, but I'm not going to be in it. It took Bob Dylan a long time. And you can understand, they're like, oh, we don't need that. You know, that's for kids. You know, I'm Bob Dylan, I'm Bruce Springsteen. But eventually everybody came aboard because, you know, it's just a great avenue for promotion, yet a different, cool, fun way to, you know, get your music out there. And as any musician knows, I don't care what era you're in, I don't care if you're talking about back then or today, getting your music from your garage to the world is a whole big thing. That's a whole art, and everybody's always worried about that. They always have been and always will be.
And you had a little bit of a hand in the Springsteen going to video.
Well, I like to say that I did. I didn't. I mean, I'm sure I didn't really, but you're very sweet for bringing up that story. I was in a restaurant with my parents in New York City one night. It was called Wally's Steakhouse, right in the middle of the theater district, and we're sitting there, and I see, much to my surprise, Bruce Springsteen walks in with 2 other people, and he sits down at a table not far from us, and I say to my parents, I go, "Oh my gosh, that's Bruce Springsteen." And my dad goes, "Who's Bruce Springsteen?" I go, "Oh my God, Dad, he was Time Magazine's Man of the Year like last year." And I'm looking over, and then Bruce says to me, he calls over and he goes, "Hey, don't I see you on MTV?" Because remember, MTV was on in New Jersey. And I said, which is kind of quick for me, I'm sort of amazed I came up with this. I said right away, "Yeah, that's more than I could say for you. When are you going to make a video?" And he was like, "Ah, ha, ha." It turns out they were in the city at that time. He was recording the Born in the USA album. So I like to say that obviously because of me, he took my advice and started making videos. So I obviously influenced Bruce's career in a very, impactful way. So I think, Bruce, if you're watching, anytime you want to send me flowers or something, I'd love to accept them.
So how are videos selected for air?
MTV had 2 distinct parts. There was us down in the studio, us kids down in the studio, and then there was the executives up in the offices. I got to be honest with you, I can't speak to what they were doing up there. I'm not, Mark Goodman was somebody who, because he was from radio and he was, always sort of who's always into the programming side, and he was always like writing memos about what we should play and how we should approach things. I was just like, take it as it comes. This all seems good to me. I don't know anything. I wasn't really, I'm very involved in that. We would get these 3/4-inch cassettes. At first, we didn't even see the videos, and that was a whole campaign. I'm sure Mark led it, of getting us the videos down in the studio so that we weren't just going, "Hey, here's the new one from the Rolling Stones," and we actually hadn't seen it. So that was a whole thing to get copies of the videos down into the studio, and we eventually did have a little video library, and we would be there, and this was, before the internet, so we would be there. I can picture right now me and Nina Blackwood sitting there with stacks of VHS cassettes and our Billboard magazines and our Teen Beat magazines and our, rock and roll encyclopedias, our Rolling Stones, doing our, Nina and I were always like the diligent little, studiers. We were always like writing things down and taking notes. So that was always sort of what we were up to. And so, yeah, you think about that's how we were doing our research, was literally magazine clippings and newspaper clippings, because you couldn't just go, "Oh, Adam Ant news, what's going, Adam Ant Twitter," whereas I could tell you what Adam Ant had for breakfast most days, but back then it was all, we were all, private eyes.
Were you advocating for certain videos too that you personally wanted to see on the air?
I don't remember that at that time, no.
Okay, let's talk about a couple of the game-changing videos that came through. You probably know the list, but I'll go through it.
Sure.
Let's start with the Buggles.
Well, the Buggles is so interesting. Russell Mulcahy directed that video, and he went on to direct so many videos like Betty Davis Eyes and, for Duran Duran, and just a ton of great 80s videos. But when he made that video for the Buggles, this was like in 1979, there was no MTV at that time. It was a really cool song, and he made that really, now iconic video. And eventually, at some point, it came onto Bob Pittman's radar. I don't really know how, but I've heard from Jeff Downs, who was one of the Buggles, that, they just got a call one day saying, "Hey, your video is going to be, the first video in this project over in New York City." And they were like, "Oh, yeah, really? Oh, okay. Yeah, sure." Like if you had called me and said, "Hey, Martha, we're going to use something for something," I'd be like, "Oh, okay." But then, little did they know, they had no idea that their song was going to launch a generation. They had no idea. So it's just really funny how, that freight train of fate affects people. And now, Jeff Downs and Trevor Horn will never, outlive the Buggles. Of all the things that they've done, the Buggles is with them forever.
Yeah. What's the name of the song?
Video killed the radio star. And when I hear the first strains of that song to this day, and I guarantee you could ask any of the cameramen who were there, any of the secretaries, any of us VJs, any of the executives, anybody who was in that first, bunch of Rebels with a Cause, who now if you saw us all in a restaurant, you'd be like, oh, who's that bunch of old folks? You do not know. We were the original rockers, and I guarantee you any of us will get misty hearing that song because it's just so, it just was the beginning of something that changed certainly our lives and the lives of so many people.